able to record now. And got it. Okay, we are now recording. All right, Jess, over to you. I'm going to put myself on mute.
Hey, thank you. So because this is an interdisciplinary thesis and I'm in the Nelson Institute, which is an interdisciplinary program, I will be presenting both about social science and also a component of atmospheric science. First, I'm going to talk about the changes in public perceptions of wetlands throughout time. So I'm going to start in the 16th century and then bring us all the way into present day. And then once we get to present day, I'm going to talk about wetland carbon cycling, start with the purpose and methods for my research on wetlands in northern Wisconsin, and then talk about the things that we found and implications for climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and wetland restoration. And then I'm going to do a recap really quickly of both of those topics. So starting with changes in public perception. So way back in the 16th century in Europe, there's evidence through the Germanic language that ill taste or smell was linked to a poisoning of the air. And this is because people were fearful of the Black Plague and diseases brought to them by insects, which caused so much destruction and death in their lives. So even before Europeans came to the United States, or what would become the United States, they already feared, they would have had a fear of wetlands because gases like methane and sulfur, which are emitted by wetlands and come with that, that noticeable smell, would have registered in their minds as something to be linked with disease. Moving into the 17th century and the 18th century, European settlement began in the United States. And this is a quote from an English explorer who came across the Great Dismal Swamp, which is between North Carolina and Virginia. And in his diary, he wrote that the Great Dismal Swamp was a horrible desert. The foul damps ascend without ceasing, corrupt the air and render it unfit for respiration. Never was rum that cordial of life found more necessary than in this dirty place. So as you can see, it really was still connected with something that was so, it was so potent smelling that wetlands were really connected with something that, you know, wasn't even fit for life. So at this point, people were still kind of staying away from wetlands and, you know, not interacting with them at all. But these same things that scared away the European settlers from wetlands protected runaway slaves and other communities of fugitives from the law because they were worried about being tracked down there. Nobody was going to navigate the thick underbrush of the wetlands, and there was also a risk of starvation. So if you could survive through that, then it was a safe place to be. Moving into the 19th century came the end of the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of the early environmentalist movement. The Swampland Acts of 1849, 1850, and 1860 incentivized wetland drainage, and due to new technology, it was possible to perform large-scale drainage, so destruction of wetlands was happening faster than ever before. The environmentalist movement also began, but it was limited. Although it helped establish national parks in the 20th century, people and nature were still seen as completely separate entities, and the movement was lacking in that it was led by white middle-class male activists, so it lacked that support from the rest of the population. And environmentalist writers, believe it or not, this is a quote from Henry David Thoreau, who was a prominent environmental writer, just like Muir and other writers. But he fell prey to the negative attitudes of people around him during his time, in that he still didn't admire wetlands despite how much he wrote about nature and how beautiful it was. This was a quote he had written in this was a speech that he would give to colleges around the country. And this was kind of like a dream sequence that he said. He saw this man standing in the middle of a boggy Stygian fen, surrounded by devils, and he had found his bounds without a doubt. Looking near, I saw that the Prince of Darkness was his surveyor. So even Henry David Thoreau saw wetlands as kind of this thing between heaven and hell, and it was full of devils. So even though environmental writers admired wetlands or wrote about them in a positive way later, they were really only attracted to superficial things about wetlands, like the pretty flowers there. They never mentioned the water, the ecosystem, or normal vegetation like sedges and stuff like that. So another elitist group of people who had the power to sway political decisions were sport hunters. Sport hunters were upset that commercial harvests were taking away from their catches. They were losing out on the waterfowl that they really enjoyed to hunt. So they started fighting for protection of wetlands. And this was actually really great for wetland protection because it resulted in the Lacey Act of 1900, which banned illegal wildlife trafficking, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, the Upper Mississippi River Fish and Wildlife Refuge was established, and the Migratory Bird Conservation Act of 1929. But people still didn't like these wetlands. In fact, this is from a publication by Dr. Ben Palmer, who was a political scientist at the University of Minnesota. And this was written in 1915. He said that wetlands were an unproductive and an economic waste, ever-present menace to the lives and health of the people. Even the U.S. Census of Agriculture said that drained wetlands were more valuable than natural wetlands in 1930. And then the Federal Highway Act of 1968, in fact, promoted the construction of highways through and above wetlands. So that was pretty detrimental to wetland ecosystems. As late as the 20th century, you could still see the association of wetlands with evil in myth and folklore. So some examples of that are the 1989 comic book Swamp Thing and the movie Creature from the Black Lagoon, which was produced in 1954. Over half of the original wetlands in the United States had been drained by this point, and the most severe degradation was experienced in the Midwest, California, and in the Everglades. The unsustainable harvesting practices that Wisconsin experienced and a lot of other places in the Midwest experienced brought the timber era to its end after the 1930s. It left behind numerous hydrologically damaged wetlands. In fact, in Wisconsin, less than 1% of old-growth forests remained. Also, the Dust Bowl spurred the creation of the USDA Soil Conservation Service in 1935. So these were focusing events that kind of forced the United States to realize that these crucial ecosystems had to be protected, or else we were really going to pay in terms of loss of ecosystem services and economic damage from a loss of production with things like timber. So the ecological research also began at that point, which started to focus on ecosystem services and habitat value in the 1970s. Finally, people of color communities were able to join the environmental movement in the 1970s. This is because at first they were fighting for more pressing issues like their basic civil rights, but once they had that addressed those concerns, they were able to fight to reduce pollution, improve sanitation, clean up their neighborhoods, and reduce the frequency of lead poisoning there. And this picture on the right is the study called Toxic Waste and Race, which was published by the United Church of Christ in 1987. And this study basically did for people of color communities what is comparable to Rachel Carson's novel, The Silent Spring, in the 1960s. So it brought to light a lot of issues that these people of color communities were facing and kind of forced a call to action from the federal government. Finally, we started to see some regulations from the federal government, such as the Clean Water Act of 1972, Section 404, which protected wetlands. It required that a permit was granted for industries to perform wetland dredging or filling, and that permit was granted by the United States EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers. There was also the National Wetlands Policy Forum of 1990, which determined this. It wasn't really a regulation, but it was more of like an unspoken kind of standard where they said there should be no further net loss in wetlands. So different administrations have interpreted this differently. Some think that it means there should be no net loss in quality of wetlands, whereas other administrations have taken it literally to mean no net loss in quantity of wetlands. And so depending on the interpretation, some administrations have decided to restore the same exact acreage of wetlands, whereas others focus more on mitigation. But there were still issues with the ways that people perceived wetlands and their importance. For example, the Clean Water Act Section 404 still allowed normal agricultural and silvicultural activities, and they allow something called compensatory wetland mitigation. What compensatory wetland mitigation says is that if you are granted a permit to perform construction or wetland dredging or filling in a wetland, and it's determined that there's no way that you could do this construction without damaging or disturbing any nearby wetlands, then they allow you to either restore or create an artificial wetland in another location. But this is damaging because oftentimes these artificial wetlands or restored wetlands don't meet performance standards. Artificial and restored wetlands, studies have shown that even 11 to 20 years after they've been restored, they still don't meet the soil, carbon, and nitrogen storage levels of natural wetlands. So they usually don't meet those performance standards of the regulations that they should be meeting. They also don't mirror societal costs, and they could contribute to social disparity and inequity, because if you're doing construction in, say, an urban setting, then the wetlands in urban settings are displaced to the outer edges of a city limit. So it takes away from the people living in the urban areas who might value that wetland for their community identity or their community value. Another issue is that studies that have studied like wetland presence over the long term have found that there are higher destruction rates in drier end wetlands. So this could be due to improper wetland delineations, and wetland delineations is how the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers determines whether a wetland is actually at a certain location. They do this with a guidebook that was created back in the 70s, and if a wetland delineator doesn't recognize that a certain area is a wetland because say it's a seasonally inundated wetland and it happens to be dry at the time that they do the wetland delineation surveying, then they'll say, okay, you can do construction there even though it is a wetland and it should be protected. The studies have also mentioned that some people believe wetlands that are drier have lesser value, but this isn't true. Drier end wetlands provide habitat for unique species such as the northern leopard frog, which is on the right, because they also protect animals from predation with the vegetation that occurs on the surface of the wetland. Finally, studies have also shown that the Euro-American fears are very much still present. People associate wetlands with danger, insects, sometimes even polio and snakes. They've mentioned vulnerabilities or perceived vulnerabilities due to homeless people or teenagers that hang out in the swamps and cause trouble. When the truth is that when wetlands increase avian presence and diversity, they can reduce the incidence of diseases like West Nile virus. Existing restoration programs do attempt to restore wetlands, but they need more financial support. In the 2014 Farm Bill, the Wetland Reserve Easement Program was very helpful in restoring wetlands and encouraging farmers to do so if they had wetlands on their property, but they need more funding in order to keep doing this and restore as much wetlands as we need to be restored. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they have a program that's called the Navigation and Ecosystem Sustainability Program. It's another example of an underfunded program that would really help with wetland restoration and protection. Romanticism can be harmful. It's because it ignores urban wetlands and it embraces this idea of like idealized nature where nature needs to be separate from people, and that's not really the case. We need to recognize that there can be wetlands in our own backyards and they still contribute ecosystem value even if they are damaged in some sense. We also need to eliminate fear by sharing wetland benefits and the consequences of destruction. Finally, wetland restoration should take into account socioeconomic and racial inequalities, the long-term success of restoration projects and how to achieve that, as well as other alternatives and wetland ecosystem services that are offered. Now to talk about wetland carbon cycling. So this is the global carbon cycle. And the numbers you see here are in petagrams of carbon per year, I believe. And this is petagrams is 10 to the 15th grams of carbon. And so wetlands are so unique because they contain both terrestrial and aquatic processes. And they're a crossover between both of these systems, and they contain almost every process that you see here. You have photosynthesis, where the wetland vegetation is absorbing carbon during the during the daytime, and sequestering carbon in their stems and leaves through plant biomass, as well as plant respiration, which is occurring at nighttime. Deposition and soil carbon is the largest part of that in wetlands. You've also got microbial respiration and decomposition, and a little bit of air-sea gas exchange where you have diffusion taking place on the surface of the wetland surface water. And then respiration and decomposition photosynthesis happening in the wetland surface water as well. So let me move on to the next section here. Oh, and sorry, going back to this previous slide, that's actually going to be gigatons of carbon per year, which is 10 to the 9th power. Now we're going to start talking about petagrams. So globally, wetlands account for 20 to 30% of all soil carbon stocks. That's a huge portion of the global carbon cycle that's stored in wetland soils. Boreal and subarctic wetlands contain 455 petagrams of carbon. And since Wisconsin is so far north, we're considered, our wetlands are considered boreal. And the North American terrestrial wetlands sequester around 1/10 of a petagram of carbon per year. And while that doesn't seem like much, when you consider that damage to the wetland can impact the amount of soil that's being stored in carbon, it is a significant part of the carbon cycle that is determined by wetlands and wetland health. There are also other values to wetlands besides carbon sequestration and storage. Wetlands can act as a buffer zone from stormwater and runoff. They can serve as fish nurseries for native fish species. They also have historic cultural value for Indigenous and African American people, and they support biodiversity through migratory birds and other species like carnivorous plants. Now I'll talk about the purpose and methods of my research. So we collected data from Flux towers that were just 29 kilometers apart and in northern Wisconsin. And according to FluxNet, there are around 500 sites globally that collect long-term eddy covariance flux data. 260 of those sites are in the Americas, and 113 of those sites are co-located. So by using co-located flux towers, you can eliminate differences due to the geographic location as well as the ecosystem type. So because we had 2 fen wetlands and they're both relatively located in the same latitude and longitude, we can look at the differences and the similarities that are strictly due to their responses to atmospheric conditions. These are the satellite images of Aliquash Creek on the left and Lost Creek on the right. Aliquash Creek, the wetland there is much smaller, and so the flux tower is smaller, and the radius that we're looking at consequentially is also much smaller. So the area of the fen at Aliquash Creek is less than 2/10 of a square kilometer, whereas for Lost Creek on the right, the size of that wetland is about 3.35 square kilometers. So there's about a magnitude difference in size here. Lost Creek is, the wetlands there is much, much larger. And then the valleys, which is, you can kind of tell between the dense forests following either side of the stream. The valley at Aliquash Creek is 140 meters wide, whereas at Lost Creek, the valley is about 300 meters wide. So the information that we collected included gas exchange and concentration of a number of other atmospheric variables. We had over 50,000 half-hourly averages of 10 hertz flux data over 5 growing seasons at 2 sites. And when I say growing season, I mean April to October, even though it's not technically growing season. That's when we had the most reliable and high quality flux data. Most of my time was spent doing quality control, and I did this using the steady state test and developed turbulent conditions test. This is because a lot of our data can be missing. This can be due to the fact that our power source is it's solar powered, so especially northern Wisconsin, you're going to have a lot of issues with power issues. There can also be, if data gets overwritten by other data, because there's so much data being collected, you can lose out on data. And finally, just random things that happen, like birds pooping on your sensors, and you need to figure out what's real, what's a real signal, and what's not. And then after you do the quality control, you flag the bad data and you remove bad data. You have to do gap filling, and I did gap filling using the marginal distribution sampling technique. What this does is it uses environmental variables like solar incoming radiation, VPD, air temperature, and it creates a lookup table. And based on your existing data, it can interpolate when or what the conditions might have been in terms of CO2 flux or methane flux for your timestamps that are missing data. Moving on to key findings and implications. So one of our main findings that was in this paper that we published was that there is an influence of the valley and the size of the valley on the flux of CO2 from the sheltered fen and the direction of the flow. So as you can see, flow in the sheltered fen was clearly northwest to southeast, and in the open fen, it was more not a single direction, and there was open flux in every direction. And then something else you can tell from this plot, or you might be able to tell, is that the sheltered fen has some darker colors, and it's a darker blue, and then the open fen, the data points are a lighter blue. This is because the open fen was emitting more carbon at nighttime, and the sheltered fen was emitting less. And we determined that this could possibly be due to a less uptake of carbon, because the canopy is kind of protecting the wetland from high wind speeds at nighttime. And then you can also see with the numbers on the axes here that the max wind speed at the sheltered fen was around 4 meters per second, and the open fen max wind speed was around 8 meters per second, so nearly double the wind speed at the open fen. And then this plot shows that this pattern was consistent throughout all years from the very beginning to the most recent data that we have. This channelized flow was very much still evident, and you can see through the yellow dots in the right plot that the CO2 emissions from the open fen were still higher. They were nearly double over double the CO2 flux of the sheltered fen at nighttime. Then I analyzed the daily CO2 cycle. So this is all of the data points we have combined and from all years, and then the bars show the standard error of the mean for that half hour average throughout all years. And what this shows is that Aliquosh, which was the sheltered fen, the smaller fen, it's emitting next to no CO2 at the early morning and late at night. Whereas the open fen, Lost Creek, is emitting around 2.1, 2.2 micromoles of CO2 per square meter per second throughout all years. And so this results in a higher nighttime CO2 emission. And then you'll see in the next plot, we looked at the methane flux. So this is a little bit of preliminary analysis, and I still have to, I'd still like to look further at this and see why this might be. But in this plot, you can see that from June to as late as our data goes, which is mid-August, about the cumulative methane emissions from the open fen have been higher than at the sheltered fen. I have some suspicions that this could be due to a release of methane when there's the early spring thaw, although because studies have shown that methane can be linked to water table level, but I'm not quite sure yet exactly why this difference might have come about. And then looking at the total yearly CO2 sink, and this is actually in carbon equivalent, so it's just the carbon sink, but what you can see is that Aliquosh Creek in all years was a much higher sea sink than Lost Creek or the open fen. And Lost Creek has a cumulative carbon sink of about negative 200 to 150 grams of carbon per year, and Aliquosh Creek, is about negative 400. And that is because that small difference that you saw in the daily CO2 cycle over the entire growing season resulted in a much larger difference in carbon sink. Here I have a plot of wavelet coherence. So what wavelet coherence does is you can compare two data sets, and it will compare the correlation of the variance of those data sets on different time scales. So on the x-axis of this plot, you have the day of the year, and since we're only looking at the carbon uptake period, that's the middle of the year. And then on the y-axis is the period or days that the data has a high magnitude squared coherence. So the yellow colors are going to be the times that are correlated, and then the blue colors are where there's no correlation. And so I compared the time series of Aliquosh Creek to Lost Creek for all of 2016, and then both sites for all of 2019. And I picked those years because I had the most consistent high quality flux data. So throughout both years, 2016 and 2019, there was a high correlation between both data sets on the scale of about a day, given that there was that plot that we saw earlier of the daily cycle. They had about the same average CO2 flux throughout the entire day. I would expect this. They both have daily cycles, so they should be correlated on about the scale of a day. There is intermittent correlation on the scale of about 8 to 16 days. I'm not really sure what processes last that long, or what that might be. And there was also correlation on the scale of about a month, and then of course correlation on the scale of the entire growing season. And I would expect there to be correlation on the scale of an entire growing season because there is a notable peak or minimum in how much carbon is sequestered throughout the growing season. And these are both fen wetlands. So there should be a lot of similarities in the processes that we're seeing at both sites. So I did this to visualize for you what the carbon sink of the sheltered fen was. I picked the sheltered fen because the open fen it has so much carbon sequestration that it was almost impossible to depict it on a screen, but I used the EPA estimate of how much carbon a car would emit per year. And I did a simple calculation using the carbon sink of Aliquosh to estimate how many cars worth of emissions could be sequestered at Aliquosh each year. So that comes out to about 60 vehicles. And then you have to account for methane emissions. So based on our estimate of the methane emissions from Aliquosh that I showed earlier for the entire year being around 3 grams of carbon per year, that's less than 1% of the entire carbon sink that is lost in the form of methane each year. And then you have to account for lateral carbon transport. So the eddy covariance method, it accounts for three-dimensional flux, but it's a measure of gas exchange. So any carbon that's lost through the stream won't be accounted for by the eddy covariance tower. And so I used a study just to estimate that this would be about 5% of the total net ecosystem exchange of carbon. But then if you think about if this fen wasn't protected and if there were disturbances that happen at this wetland, these numbers would be much different. And there are studies that have shown that at disturbed wetlands, you can expect as much as 10% of your carbon sink to be lost in the form of methane, and around 35% can be lost as carbon going down a stream. So you'd expect around 30% lost to lateral transport. So that's around that's about half of your carbon sink that's going to be lost if you have disturbances taking place at your site. So to wrap up the key findings and implications of this research. So the small valley of the sheltered fen at Aliquosh Creek resulted in channelized flow and lower nighttime CO2 emissions than at Lost Creek. In addition, wetland CO2 fluxes were correlated on scales of a day, week, month, and entire growing season. Finally, sheltered fen methane fluxes appear to be more temperature sensitive, but the open fen emitted more methane in the summertime. And further analysis is required to determine why these patterns might be in existence. And then the things I'd like you to take away from this presentation, if you remember nothing else, is that small forested wetlands offer ecosystem services that could rival or even surpass that of larger wetlands. If you're thinking about the sea sink at Aliquosh, for example, Aliquosh was a magnitude smaller than Lost Creek, and it still sequestered more carbon and performed the vital ecosystem services that Lost Creek did in terms of carbon mitigation and climate mitigation. Also, natural wetlands emit less than 1% of the carbon sink as methane, but may emit more with higher temperatures and extreme precipitation. So this is something we need to keep in mind in the future as our climate begins to change. The value of these wetlands and the gas exchange processes that happen there could be damaged, and then they could act as a feedback loop by emitting more methane, resulting in further damaged kind of processes happening there. And attitudes towards wetlands in the United States have improved over time. There was a huge shift from the 16th century to very recently, in terms of a complete fear of wetlands, to a hatred of wetlands, to the recognition that wetlands are vital ecosystems, and without them, we can have more extreme and more frequent flash floods and things like the Dust Bowl and soil erosion. And we've started to really protect these wetlands, but there's still a need for further evolution of attitudes. It's clear that the regulations regarding wetland protection and restoration don't really match up with the attitudes that people have towards them. When you look at the ability of people who are granted permits to do wetland mitigation, and how mitigated wetlands or artificial wetlands might not necessarily meet the standards or the regulation of natural wetlands. Finally, I'd like to thank my committee members, Encore, Emily, Stanley, and Leah Horowitz for their time guiding me through this project. Also, thanks to the North Temperate Lakes LTER project and USGS for sharing their data, and Ameriflux, which helped me significantly with my post-processing of my data. And finally, thanks to all my lab mates for your support.
All right. I wish I had a applause machine, but can kind of imagine the applause in the background. Oh, look, Amara was able to send a clap sign. That's kind of cool. I don't know how that works. We'll open it up for questions. I went ahead, all of you are muted right now, so you can either unmute and ask, or if you feel like you'd rather send it through the chat window on the right, you can go ahead and do that, and I'll just pass on the messages. Wait a second, too. I'll go ahead and start with just a question for early on, but I was just kind of curious with the methane budget. It seems consistent that both methane and CO2 are higher, but did you account for the greenhouse gas long-term warming potential of methane, or just looked at it in carbon budget? As you know, that's a complicated topic.
By long-term warming potential, like, what do you mean by that? Like the magnitude of like?
Well, so that methane is a stronger greenhouse gas, and so you can add it to just a carbon budget as a net carbon, or you can a factor of 20-ish or so to estimate the net radiative effect on wetlands. So,
yeah, no, I haven't looked at that, but I think I know what you're talking about. I've seen some papers use like a formula for warming potential that they use. Yeah, that would be interesting to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the challenges of wetland is that those radiative potentials are based on pulse emissions. Wetlands are continuously taking up CO2 and methane, and so trying to estimate the true contribution to climate change from wetland methane emissions versus CO2 sequestration is not as straightforward as fossil fuels. But yeah, it's really cool data. Brad, I see you unmuted. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so the figure that you showed for the closed fen that had the highest CO2 emissions, it seemed like there was a peak in the emissions kind of from the southwest quadrant. Is that because of some? Why do you think that is? Is that flux from upwind, or is there something unique about the structure of that open or the closed fen in the southwest?
Maybe I can share my screen again. So
Yeah.
So you were talking about, let me see. Ooh.
That figure 30, yep, 29.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's like the peak CO2 fluxes are kind of in the southwest quadrant. Then I guess if you look at 26, is that that's kind of got the longest fetch of the overall place. Is that right?
Yeah.
Or is that, yeah.
Looking at the map, it looks like the river or the creek, sorry, is might be coming from that direction. So I wonder if that has something to do with that. I'm not sure. I didn't really notice that before. It looks like it's maybe more evident in 2019.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it's a little bit of an artifact, the color scale. It's not as different as the colors look, but part of that is there is a vegetation gradient at that site. So there is both alder and willow shrub species, and they're kind of separated in space where they are. And it's something that I've long thought about trying to do, is apply a directional footprint analysis to separate the contribution of those two separate species. You can kind of see it in the color there on the imagery, but there is a slightly different, and one of them is an end fixer, the alder, and so there may be a slightly different CO2 signal coming from those. But it's an interesting question.
Thank you.
Let's see, Elizabeth sent a question by chat. She was wondering two things. I'll just go ahead and read those to you. From what you've learned from these two sites, how would you estimate the net carbon sink or ecosystem service due to wetlands in the entire state of Wisconsin? Which site would you use to estimate? Some combination of the two? And I've noticed that you deliberately used the word wetlands instead of swamps. Do you have some thoughts about the use of those words and the baggage that the word swamps carry? So two questions there.
Yeah, I think definitely there's some negative connotation around the word swamps, and this phrase that people used to throw around, drain the swamp, because swamps are always associated with like a lack of development, and that was not the goal early on in European settlement, and even as late as like the industrial era. If I had to estimate the net carbon sink of wetlands in the state of Wisconsin, something I used to look at wetland types was the Wisconsin Wetland Inventory. I don't know if they have that for all states, but it's a GIS tool you can use to map wetlands that were surveyed. I think it might have been like in the 90s that was done, so I think that's still pretty accurate to this day. So I might just pick, I maybe would just pick like an average for undisturbed wetlands and extrapolate that using like a basic surface area mapping tool, do something like that. I think wetlands in Wisconsin tend to be relatively healthier than in other states, so it might be better to do it in Wisconsin than like say California or something like that, where you would have a higher variation of carbon sink throughout the entire state.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think your work very clearly shows a scale dependence to wetland carbon uptake. So on a per area basis, even though the two wetlands are different spatial scales, there's a different net uptake. And that's something that usually is not considered in scaling up wetland carbon fluxes. Usually people will take chamber measurements from a handful of places and just multiply the average times the area of wetlands. And I think your work is kind of calling into question the fact that the wind sheltering effect influences how much net carbon you lose at night in particular. I think is something that hadn't been shown before. So that's cool. Anything else, or?
I got a quick question.
Oh, go ahead, David.
Jessica, you mentioned, I think you said there's like a study you cited that had 5% export of carbon to the streams. Do you think that number, can you just expand upon that a little bit? Do you think that number would be similar between the two sites? Did you actually like look at measurements of stream carbon? I'm sure Emily Stanley somewhere just smiled if I asked that question. Yeah, just kind of expand on that a little bit if you don't mind.
Yeah, so we had some really old stream CO2 data, and I did do some analysis on that, and it looked like it was even smaller than the study that stated that 5% stream CO2. I think our wetland had like less than 1% of total CO2 was lost to the stream. However, that is not during the non-growing season. And I think during non-growing season, especially with like snow melt or things being kind of covered by snow and ice, that there could be losses that we're not accounting for happening at that point.
If you wanted to try to estimate, even crudely estimate, how much carbon is kind of going into the streams at each of the sites, what kind of information do you think you would need to do that? Does that make sense?
Think you could look at the partial pressure of CO2 as well as do some kind of like DOC analysis, and then maybe look at some other like maybe inorganic forms of carbon that are lost through the stream as well. What would you do, David?
So I've not been to Aliquash Creek before, but to me, Lost Creek, like I feel like there's a significant amount of water that's kind of not in the stream channel, right? Like there's kind of water flowing through a lot more of the plant substrate. So I just was thinking, I don't feel like whatever number it is, let's say 5% of net carbon is exported by the stream. I don't feel like that should be constant between the sites. Because I just imagine the physical structure of the wetlands very different, not to mention everything else is a little bit different between the sites. I like the idea, don't get me wrong, of like two sites spatially close together, so you kind of throw away some of the variability and say this is just, there's not a lot of atmospheric or air temperature or net radiation variability. So these are the differences of the wetlands, but the wetlands themselves are just not open and closed. I think there's a lot of other structural differences. Just some random thoughts, that's all.
Thanks.
Well, and do you want to talk about what your idea for your NSF grad proposal, which came about from looking at PCO2 at the streams?
Yeah, I know David had I had forced David to look at that. But yeah, it was looking at using partial pressure of stream CO2 along with some other variables like wind speed and time of day to create a proxy for eddy covariance flux. But I do think that's there are other things that I definitely should consider, and something else I've thought about is I'm assuming, like Ankur said earlier, I'm assuming that methane gets split up into carbon, and I'm just doing like the carbon equivalent, but I'm not accounting for like gases forming and microbial processes and stuff like that. So
yeah, it'll be interesting to see what we do next, but we have real-time in situ PCO2 and P-methane sensors in the Aliquash Creek and PCO2 in Lost Creek. And so one of the ideas is that high frequency measurements of PCO2 could be a way to kind of look at that export terrestrial aquatic coupling. This is a big area right now. For example, Department of Energy's funding call for ecosystem research and climate research, terrestrial aquatic coupling of carbon is like on their top of their list, up there with cloud aerosol radiation and stuff. And so topic right now, and so it'd be exciting to see where folks go with this, and both in wetland systems and all sorts of other systems as well, where we see a lot of expert gas relevant processes between aquatic and terrestrial systems. Okay, let's go ahead and thank Jess again then. And as I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and those of you who would like to stick around in about 5 minutes or so, we're doing a Scilab social to both congratulate Jess on her presentation and her NSF award, and just check